Thanks for tuning into Poured Over, the Barnes & Noble podcast. My name is Chris Gillespie. My guest today is a writer, editor, and former Entertainment Weekly film critic whose work has appeared in Esquire, Sports Illustrated, and Vanity Fair. He's the author of Caddyshack, the making of a Hollywood Cinderella story, as well as his most recent book, The Future Was Now, Mad Men, Mavericks, and the Epic Sci-Fi Summer of 1982, which is now available in paperback. Please join me in welcome to the show, Chris Nashawaty. Chris, how are you doing today?
Great. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for being here. I'm really excited to get to talk to you about the new book, or the recent book. I know it's just coming out in paperback, especially because we are in the midst of yet another summer blockbuster season, kind of like what you write about in the book. And I can't help but feel that, you know, the summer blockbuster season that we're in right now is a direct, albeit distant, relative of the summer of 1982. Is it safe to say that 1982 was sort of the first ever summer blockbuster season as we now know it?
Yeah, I mean, there were summer blockbusters before the summer of 1982. Obviously, Jaws and Star Wars come to mind in 1975 and 1977. But it was the success of those movies that really sort of kicked off what we now call summer movie season, summer blockbuster season. And 1982, and the 8 films that are covered in this book, are really the first time that we saw like Hollywood carpet bombing the summer, you know, packing every weekend with a big title. And it really is a trend that began in 1982 and has returned every summer since.
To varying levels of success, I think, and popularity. I think you also pointed out in the book that at the time, at least, I don't know if this timeline is still accurate with modern technology and everything like that, but you'd said that sort of the timeline or the delay that Hollywood was working on at the time was kind of 5 years. So you really can trace 1982 back to 1977, which is truly when Star Wars came out. And 1982 is sort of a response to that initial massive success of Star Wars, which we now know is Episode 4 in New Hope, but was just then called Star Wars. Is that timeline accurate? It really is kind of an echo of Star Wars?
100%. You know, making movies in Hollywood is like turning an aircraft carrier. It takes time. When Star Wars came out in the summer of 1977 and became this really sort of unexpected phenomenon, every studio in town decided that it needed its own science fiction, big sweeping tentpole movie. And so, you know, following the success of Star Wars, they all sort of said, okay, where's ours? Where's our Star Wars? And so the scramble began, and it takes about 5 years to, you know, pitch a movie, then write the screenplay, then get it up and running, and shoot it, and edit it, and get it ready for theaters. So by the summer of 1982, we are really finally seeing the children that Star Wars birthed.
And those movies, for the listeners at home, so they understand which movies we're going to be talking about, because I think we're probably going to be jumping around. There's E.T., Poltergeist, Blade Runner, Tron, Conan the Barbarian, The Thing, Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, and Mad Max II, The Road Warrior. That's all of them, right?
That is correct. Those are the 8 films that we focus on in the book, and they all came out within a 6 to 7 week window, which is really sort of mind-boggling when you think about it.
It is, and I think, I mean, obviously I haven't spoken to a lot of people about this, but as I've been reading the book and kind of watching these movies and talking to people about it, I think everyone's surprised to hear that I talked to about it, at least, that all of these movies came out not only in the same year, but like within weeks of each other. Like it's hard for people to wrap their heads around the fact that all of these movies, there was a summer when all of these movies were out in the theaters at one time.
Yeah, it's sort of crazy to think about now. You know, if you had 2 or 3 of those movies in any given summer season, you'd say, oh, wow, that was a really good summer. But to have 8 of them come back to back to back like rat-a-tat-tat is just insane. You know, I have to say, I was 13 years old in the summer of 1982. So Needless to say, this was pretty much the greatest summer of my life. And I spent a lot of time indoors when I should have been outdoors watching these movies. And even the ones that are a little bit more mature, like The Thing, that is a movie that when you're a 13-year-old boy, you can't get into, so you get creative. And so me and my buddies would, slide $5 to an older teenager online and say, "Hey, can you get us tickets?" And sneak our way in. So you had to be a little bit creative, but it was really a spectacular summer to be a teenage kid.
So you saw all of these movies in the theater that summer?
I did, 100%. Some of them more than once.
Was that something that kind of those memories, did that inform your decision to write this book in the first place, where you're like, man, that was a really fun summer? Or did you have to, in looking back through history or recent years or whatever, did you realize like, oh, 1982 was actually kind of a special year that might be interesting to explore in a book?
It wasn't until I really started digging into it that I realized just how loaded that summer was.
Mm-hmm.
The origin really of the book is that, I wrote two of my favorite movies, Blade Runner and The Thing. Both opened on the same day, June 25th, 1982. And so I was writing about that day for an essay for Esquire. And what's interesting is at the time when I was writing it, I was focusing on the fact that these two sort of seminal science fiction movies were actually not successful on their initial release. The critics really didn't care for them, and the reviews weren't great. And in terms of box office, neither one did very well. In fact, The Thing did really poorly. And I found that interesting. And so as I was writing the story, I started digging into that summer. And it was only when I started digging into it, I noticed just how wall to wall full of these movies that summer was. And that really got me thinking about, oh yeah, I remember going to see all of these movies. And it really wasn't until then that I really figured out that, all of my memories came flooding back. And it ended up being both a really eye-opening bit of reporting as I was talking to all the people involved in these movies, but also just a really great nostalgic trip, just of a really wonderful time in my life.
While you were going back through that and researching those movies and revisiting that time in your life, were you also listening to the music that you were listening to at that time? I mean, you may still be doing that anyways, right?
Yeah.
But was that something where you're like, oh man, I feel like I'm writing this book right now, I should put on some music from the summer of 1982?
It's really funny that you bring that up. I mean, yes, the answer is yes. I've always sort of felt that, and this may not be the most original observation, but I've always felt that the movies and the music that you listen to when you're a teenager are the things that you'll always love the most. You know what I mean? It just, everything hits harder at that age. And I just sort of feel like there's something about being so receptive at that age to, wonder and just how impactful things are, whether it's music or movies, that sticks with you forever. So, yes, as I was writing about some of my favorite movies that were indelibly etched into my brain, I found myself throwing on the music. I went on YouTube and started watching some of the TV shows I watched back then. It was really a trip back in time. And it was really, I had so much fun writing it. And hopefully that comes across.
I think so. It's a really fun book to read, like in terms of the film history. If listeners, if you're a movie buff, if you love these movies, like it's such a great piece of reporting, really, because I mean you cover these 8 different productions, these 8 different movies in a way that I think in some situations, like I could see that being very difficult to juggle, both for you as the author, kind of keeping all of these narrative threads together. But you do such an awesome job of building upon these things and keeping everything separate that at no point when I was reading was I confused about what movie you were discussing. I was like, okay, got it. We're like, right now we're in Mad Max mode. Got it. Okay, now we're in Tron mode. Like, because there's so many different players and settings and characters to keep track of, but you organize it and structure it in such a great way that it's so easy to follow. And it is kind of like watching a documentary almost.
Well, thanks for saying that. It was a challenge because my previous book was about one movie, Caddyshack, and so it's very easy to just do that chronologically and have it be easy to follow. But when you're juggling and toggling between 8 different movies, you really need to worry about structure and transitions and all of that to make it so it's not a confusing jumble mess. So it's nice to hear that. That was probably the biggest challenge of the whole book is finding a way to go back and forth between these movies and then pick up that thread again later on. It was difficult, but hopefully it works.
So then when you were writing, did you write the chronology of like an entire movie at once? Like, did you do them individually, then go through and cut them and kind of turn them into a quilt? Or did you be like, hey, I'm kind of feeling the thing right now. I'm going to write a little bit about the thing. I'm going to go do ET for a little bit.
Yeah, that would have probably been the smarter way to do it. That's not how I did it. I actually, I sort of mapped out beats of like, story beats. So, if I wanted to talk about, okay, this is where Oliver Stone is writing Conan the Barbarian, then I want to jump to, chronologically to, Ridley Scott coming on board Blade Runner and quitting his work on what was then going to be his version of Dune. I just sort of mapped it out in a way that, maybe in retrospect wasn't the ideal way to write the book, but that's how I ended up doing it.
I don't think you may not have necessarily known this going into the book, although you might have as just a fan, as a film critic and as a film historian. But for the most part, all of these productions are kind of dramatic in their own different ways. Like there's not one of them that's kind of like, we had this idea for the movie, we wrote the script, went super smoothly, production was great. Like each one of them has a almost kind of different existential problem that almost kills the movie at some point.
Yeah, I got lucky in that regard. Fortunately, none of them was smooth sailing. It makes for better reading. I mean, look, I think that movies are really difficult to make, and they're really expensive propositions, and you've got really big personalities. And I think that, when you really dig into the details and the minutia of any movie production, there's gonna be rich stuff there. Is it going to be as rich as these 8 were? No. So in that sense, I did get lucky, but movies in general are very dramatic making of situations. It does at times feel like a real high stakes soap opera. And, there's a lot on the line for all of these movies and for all of these studios and really for Hollywood at the time. I mean, this was a real turning point in cinema. And so, the stakes were really, really high.
Is there one particular instance of the drama of production that sticks in your mind as kind of a particularly interesting or amusing story from one of these movies?
Well, I think the most trouble-plagued one was probably Blade Runner, simply because it was a really big production, and Ridley Scott had a lot of trouble with his crew. He really didn't get along very well with Harrison Ford, his star. Harrison Ford didn't really get along with his co-stars, especially Sean Young. There was a producer on the film who was really breathing hard down Ridley Scott's neck. It had a lot of really, really difficult moments. And so for me, I mean, Ridley Scott was basically, the film was kind of taken away from him at one point, and then they realized they couldn't do it without him. So he was brought back on sort of reluctantly. And, it was based on a book by Philip K. Dick, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And Philip K. Dick was starting this sort of stealth campaign to sort of sabotage the movie. So there was a ton going on with this movie. The other example I'll give you is with Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, which was a fairly smooth production once it got going. But before then, it was really difficult because Leonard Nimoy, who played Spock, did not want to come back for the movie. He had a real love-hate relationship with the character of Spock. He just sort of saw himself as an actor who had more to offer than this one character. And so they really had to woo him hard to do the movie. And once he agreed to do the movie, a pretty key part of that movie and part of the way they got him back into it was to promise that they were going to kill off Spock. And once that leaked out to the public, that became a real PR disaster. People were writing to Paramount, the studio, saying, this was the tone of the letters that they were getting. There was one letter that Paramount received that said, "If Spock dies, you die." So, I mean, this is how much people cared about this movie and how much was on the line with this movie.
And the way that they ended up handling that, because that moment in the book and that moment in the production of Star Trek II was something that stood out to me as well, because I can, maybe more so than some of the other movies that you write about, but I feel like Star Trek, because it is such a series and then would go on to spawn so many sequels, that was the one that was kind of reminding me the most of kind of like modern day superhero movies or the MCU or the DC superhero movies, where I was kind of thinking like, oh man, if one of those MCU movies was leaked in a major way like that before production, that would be such a huge issue. But the way that they ended up handling it with The Wrath of Khan, I thought was really clever and funny. They killed off Spock immediately in a way that they were kind of like, see, there you go, he's dead, but he's not actually dead because the whole thing was a training simulation. And the whole opening sequence is tongue in cheek of William Shatner saying like, I thought you were dead. And they have a good laugh. And I'm like, that's a pretty good way to handle that, Paramount.
Yeah, no, they did a good job. And the credit for that goes to Nicholas Meyer, the director and writer of the movie, who was smart enough to really, have a little bit of fun with it. It dealt with it in a very clever way. And then, once Nimoy was on the set and making the movie, and the death scene that comes at the end was handled so beautifully, he started to think to himself, well, maybe I don't want to die. You know what I mean? Maybe I want to come back. This was really fun. So, they had to leave the door open at the end for the possibility of a return. It was like Crisis Management 101, and they aced it.
Of all the different directors that you write about in the book, was there anyone in particular who you thought was the most interesting to write about?
I don't think there's anyone more interesting in Hollywood ever than Steven Spielberg. He is, in my opinion, just the greatest there's ever been and ever will be. I say that as someone whose favorite movie as a kid and still as a 50-something-year-old man is Jaws. I just think that Spielberg is the master of masters. And so in the summer of 1982, he has 2 movies out of the 8 that we talk about. The first one is E.T., which is a tremendously personal movie for him. It's sort of a reflection and a metaphor for growing up as a lonely kid, bit of an outsider, looking for a friend. And that's Elliot in E.T. So the other movie is sort of a darker tale about growing up in suburbia in a family without a dad, which again, very personal for Spielberg, and that's Poltergeist. So to me, he's really the central figure of the summer of 1982.
And he, more so than the other directors, or maybe not more so, but he also has a direct line to the godfather of all of this, being George Lucas, having that connection of having just worked on Raiders of the Lost Ark, having been friends with George Lucas, it seems like a good friendship. It seems like there's some playful rivalry there. I know that they took out ads in the newspaper when each other passed each other at the box office.
Yeah.
But there seems to be a real level of camaraderie and respect between the two of them.
Oh, 100%. They were of the same generation. They both were sort of, film school geek kids who just grew up obsessed with movies. They really understood one another. I mean, they're very different people, but they saw in the other a piece of themselves. And like you mentioned, Spielberg's Jaws became the biggest movie of all time in 1975. Then Lucas's Star Wars became the biggest movie of all time in 1977. And then it was passed back to Spielberg with E.T. And it's, and there's Close Encounters in there too. So it's really a great friendship and a story that's been told before. It's in my book, hopefully with some more detail than you've read it elsewhere. But, there's this really wonderful moment when George Lucas is really nervously awaiting the box office fate of Star Wars on opening weekend, and he decides to get the hell out of Hollywood and away from all of the news and box office figures coming in, and he goes to Hawaii with his wife, and he invites Spielberg to come along. And while they're there, just playing on the beach, making sandcastles like two kids on a play date, Lucas mentions to him this idea he has for a movie, and it ends up being Raiders of the Lost Ark. And he says to him, what are you planning on doing next? And Spielberg says, I don't know. Once I finish Close Encounters, I'd love to direct a James Bond movie. And Lucas says to him, I've got something better. Let's do this. I'll produce it. You direct it. Let's go. Raiders of the Lost Ark. And so it's just this really great origin story for one of the, the most iconic, movies of all time. But it really shows how sort of joined at the brain and the hip these two were.
And then the other kind of connective tissue there is, well, there's actually a couple of pieces now that I'm thinking about it, but one being Harrison Ford, who obviously was in Star Wars as Han Solo, in Raiders of the Lost Ark as Indiana Jones, and then also in Blade Runner, as well as I'm going to blank on her name right now, but I know the writer of E.T., the
Melissa
woman
Matheson.
who was, yes, she was involved, or she was dating Harrison Ford at the time and kind of got into the E.T. fold that way.
Yeah. It's interesting. She's a really sort of unsung hero in this book, and hopefully I give her due because she deserves it. She was so much more than Harrison Ford's girlfriend. She had written this movie, The Black Stallion, prior to working on E.T. She went over to the set of Raiders of the Lost Ark in Africa to see Harrison Ford, her boyfriend at the time. And while she was there, Spielberg made the connection finally, like, oh my God, she isn't just Harrison Ford's girlfriend. She wrote this movie I love called The Black Stallion. Mm-hmm. And at the time, Spielberg had the idea of E.T. percolating in his brain. He just didn't know how to crack it. And so after sort of becoming friends with Melissa Matheson on the set and knowing how good a writer she was, he said, can you take a crack at this movie, which was then called E.T. and Me? And, she hemmed and hawed, and Spielberg got Harrison Ford involved to try to convince her to do it. And eventually she did. And she wrote, Spielberg says it's still the best script he's ever read. And it was essentially the movie that they shot is what she wrote. So, she's a great character in this book.
Maybe it's Harrison Ford. Was there one actor in particular who really, the summer of '82, changed their trajectory, or that you found the most interesting to write about?
Yeah, I mean, Harrison Ford, the only for sure, the only other one that really can rival him, I think, is Arnold Schwarzenegger from Conan the Barbarian. Schwarzenegger was. It's hard to sort of remember now. There was a time when he was simply known as a bodybuilder. That was a very fringy subculture at the time. And he was a big fish in a small pond. And he had dreams of becoming a Hollywood actor. But, those dreams seemed really far-fetched to a lot of people because, he had this very unique and sort of, stunning look. But at the same time, he did not speak English very well. And, when he was cast in Conan the Barbarian, the writer of that screenplay, Oliver Stone, sat down with Schwarzenegger and had him basically read Conan comic books out loud so he could get a sense of of the way Schwarzenegger spoke and the accent. And it had the effect of making the dialogue much more spare in the movie because of Schwarzenegger's accent. So at the end of the day, in the finished film of Conan, I think Schwarzenegger really only has like 16 lines in the whole movie, and that's because he was much more arresting visually than he was, verbally. I found him to be a really interesting character. His ambition at that time was so sky high, and the odds stacked against him were so high. And he just, by force of will, committed to this movie and put up with a lot to make it happen.
And to that point, they really needed someone who was going to be that tough and ambitious for that role, because that production sounded, maybe more so than the other productions you write about, that one sounds really grueling. Like, I know that they were out in Spain, or I forget exactly where, but they were up against the elements all the time. I mean, Arnold's out there basically, not wearing a bunch, not wearing a ton of clothes. Yeah. I think at some point in the book you write about how he was chased by a pack of dogs that were supposed to be wolves, and they just didn't stop when they were supposed to.
Yeah, I mean, the director of that movie is this guy, John Milius, who's a real sort of macho guy. He hit it off with Schwarzenegger, but he also put him through the meat grinder to make this movie. Like you mentioned, there was a scene where Schwarzenegger's Conan is being chased by wolves up this, rock face. And he was given a head start to run ahead of these dogs. And they also put like pieces of like meat in his loincloth to sort of get the dogs to really be chasing him pretty hard. Milius did not give him enough of a head start, and they caught up with him and, kind of attacked him, and he went tumbling down this rock face and got pretty banged up. There's another scene in this movie. It's a sword fight, like a broadsword. And I think the handle flew off, and the sword cut his, like, right next to his jugular. And he's lying on the ground, gushing blood. And this gives you a sense of Milius as a character. He says to Schwarzenegger, like, he doesn't say, doctors are on the way, I'm getting an ambulance, blah blah blah. He just looks at him and says, pain is temporary, film is forever. It's not the most sympathetic guy, but Schwarzenegger really got put through the mill on this one.
And someone who's not Arnold Schwarzenegger would have been broken way earlier in that. I mean, I think about, you talk about when you're discussing the production of Blade Runner, Harrison Ford was upset that Ridley Scott was not giving him more personalized attention as an actor. Yeah. Meanwhile, Arnold Schwarzenegger is being chased by wolves and almost getting his head chopped off.
Exactly.
But Harrison Ford really doesn't want to do the voiceover for Blade Runner.
Oh my God, that's one of my favorite stories in the whole book is, when Harrison Ford signed on to do Blade Runner, he really liked the script, but he did not like the idea of the voiceover, which is how the movie was released. It came with a voiceover. Later, It was released without the voiceover. The voiceover divides fans quite a bit. Most big fans of the movie do not like the voiceover. I happen to like it. That's the way I first saw the movie, and it has, to me, it has like a real film noir vibe to it. So I don't mind it at all. But Harrison Ford hated it, and that was one of the conditions, for signing on to the movie. And it was going to be released that way, but at the end of the day, the producers and the studio and the test screenings all said that the movie was confusing. So they ended up putting the voiceover back in, and they said to Harrison Ford, hey, I know you had a really tough time making this movie. You didn't get along with the director, and it wasn't a pleasant experience for you. And oh, by the way, you now have to go into a recording studio and record this voiceover that you said you didn't want to do. And he had to do it 3 times. So not a happy camper on this movie. And you can kind of tell that when you listen to the voiceover. He sounds like someone who's like reading a hostage note or a ransom note. He does not sound very thrilled about it.
And Harrison Ford baseline is not necessarily the most jovial, upbeat kind of like.
Exactly.
talking about Blade Runner, something that's interesting is that we, being in 2025, are now past the year that Blade Runner was originally set. Right. Original Blade Runner takes place in 2019, I think it is, and they have flying cars and humanoid cybernetic people. Also, space travel, space colonization has already happened and is kind of already blasé at that point. Hopefully it won't be a shock for the listeners at home to know that we do not have those things in 2025. But either Blade Runner or kind of all of these movies as a whole, how do you think that they influence the public's perception of what the future was going to be back in 1982?
Yeah, I mean, I'm frankly still waiting for my jetpack to get to work every day. We were promised jetpacks, but you know, on the other side of the coin, you know, I currently have in my pocket a telephone that I can listen to any music I want to at any time I want to. I can have FaceTime calls like they do on the Jetsons. You know, I can go on this thing called the internet. I mean, like, yeah, we don't have the specific things that they pointed to in some of these movies. We have come a pretty far way on a lot of other fronts. You know, some people will be reading this book on, you know, a reading device rather than, you know, on printed paper. And so, you know, the future is remarkable, but it's not quite maybe how we envisioned it in 1982. I'm frankly okay with the fact that we don't have killer replicants walking around, but I would like a flying car very much.
I did have this kind of uncanny moment when I was working on my notes and everything that I was thinking about this. And I was like, oh, because in my mind, I'm watching these movies. I'm like, the future's nothing like this. Like 2025, this looks nothing like Blade Runner. Like, I don't know. But then I had the realization that both in Blade Runner and also in Star Trek, people were effectively using video calls to communicate. And I was like, I'm going to be talking to Chris over Zoom, which is a video call. So I'm like, okay, all right, that's pretty futuristic. The other thing that I noticed was that there's this line in when I was watching Tron where they're talking about it's almost even more of just like a throwaway line that like stood out to me specifically watching in 2025, where they're talking about artificial intelligence. And one of the scientists is like, oh, yeah, well, you know, once the computers start thinking, people are going to stop thinking. And I was like, I literally just read in the news that there was a study about how using AI tools diminishes your brain abilities. I'm like, that is 110% correct. Like, computers are thinking so people don't have to. They got that. They hit the nail on the head with that one.
The thing that makes science fiction so great is that it grapples with these really thorny, fantastical ideas and presents them in a way that's matter of fact, and you can really get lost in them. And so science fiction movies have the added benefit of being able to show you that. And one of the things that's so great about the films that are in this book, that are covered in this book, is that all of them create these worlds that are just transporting. You know, I mean, you really, like even Mad Max, you know, The Road Warrior, not a very positive vision of the future, but man, does it take you there and make you feel it. It's just really, to me, that's why it's the most exciting genre in movies and fiction.
There's an element of possibility to it that can be exciting, but also scary.
Yeah, oh yeah.
I think something that I wanted to talk to you about was, is there, because there seems to me something, thinking about all these movies, maybe aside from Mad Max, which is kind of a darker, pessimistic thing. I mean, Blade Runner is also extremely dark. I mean, it's more spectacular with the technologies, but it seems like socially and morally, Blade Runner is pretty bankrupt of, you know, that depiction of the future. But something like Star Trek, which is a very positive, humanistic view of the future, and I would even wager that E.T., another kind of positive, like, well, aliens are out there, but actually they're very lovable and we could actually connect with them on a deep level. Is that something that, it seems to me that sci-fi now, and I could be wrong by saying this might be an overgeneralization, but it seems like as a society and as a movie-going audience, we've kind of lost touch with that optimistic side of the future, and that it seems like most future tales now are those dystopian leaning ones that are more in the vein of Mad Max or Blade Runner. Do you think that that is connected to our political moment? Was that optimism something that could have only happened in 82 in kind of a moment of like, Reagan being president, coming out of the space race only, 10 or so years earlier? Is that optimism still around now in sci-fi, or is it kind of gone?
I think it's still there, but I do think that, just the mood of like the times or the zeitgeist or whatever is a little darker. I think there was something about the early 80s. We were coming out of Vietnam, Watergate had happened, people distrusted the government. I think there was a mood in the country, and especially with Reagan coming into office, where people were ready for some good news, for some optimism. And so that's why I think a movie like E.T. really resonates. I think it's also why a movie like The Thing, John Carpenter's The Thing, which shows aliens like E.T., but these aliens are much darker. It's the dark flip side of E.T. in a way. One has a friendly alien who's your buddy, and one has an alien that's going to take over your body and like twist it inside out and then try to kill everyone. It's not surprising to me that movie was the least successful of the 8 movies in 1982. I think if The Thing came out now, when we're more sort of conditioned for darker science fiction stories, it would do a lot better. It just had the misfortune of being poorly timed. People didn't want a darker, more ambiguous story. People respond to what else is going on in the culture. And I think that, right now, science fiction has taken a darker turn. That said, I think that Blade Runner was so influential. It's not an accident that like every movie that came after Blade Runner, their vision of the future looks like Blade Runner. It's because that vision was so arresting and so stunning because of Ridley Scott that, that became the blueprint for what the future is going to look like. It became almost like shorthand for what the future was going to look like.
Flying cars, giant neon signs, giant skyscrapers, sprawling
dark,
industrial
but also
landscapes.
Dark and dingy and acid rain and, the hodgepodge of people speaking different languages. It's all very sort of disorienting for people.
Kind of moving off of that, do you think that there's a possibility? I know that we started our conversation by alluding to, it's summer now. There's a lot of blockbusters that are out there. It almost seems like if these blockbusters were to do as well as movies can do now, that it could be a similar size blockbuster season to 1982. Because I know that there's, we're pre-recording this a little bit, but the new Superman movie's coming out. I know there's a new Jurassic World movie. Disney and Marvel obviously want Fantastic Four to do extraordinarily well. That's coming out later this month. I know there's Lilo and Stitch. There's 28 Years Later, all these different things, all these huge movies. Is it possible for a summer blockbuster season to be as influential as 1982? Or is our culture so fragmented, movies in the theaters aren't as important now? Can there still be a big splash at the box office in the summertime?
It's a big question. So I think that it's entirely possible that we can have a summer blockbuster season that's as commercially successful, if not much more commercially successful as 1982. But that said, I don't think the originality and creativity and that sort of influence is there anymore, because the movies that you just named that are coming out this summer are all, franchises, extensions, sequels, prequels, spin-offs, reboots. There's very little, I don't mean to be cynical about it, but there's very little originality there. And one of the things that I hope people take away from reading this book is that the summer of 1982 was, in a way, this really golden moment that no longer exists of total originality and creativity. Yes, Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan was a sequel. And yes, Blade Runner was based on a book, and some of the others had earlier lives. But these movies weren't cookie cutter, assembly line product extensions. They were movies with an artistic vision made by really original voices that were smart. They had something to say. They weren't just out to, make you empty your wallet. They were also there to make you think. And I don't get the sense that Hollywood's in that business anymore. And that bums me out. So I think that, the book is a celebration, but it's also a little bit of like an elegy of this sort of past period that's a little bit gone and hopefully will come back, because the studios were really taking some big gambles in 1982. And now they're gambling with money, but they're really not gambling with creativity in the same way. So I hope that people in Hollywood read the book and maybe decide to maybe try to step it up a little bit in that regard.
Well, I was watching E.T. last night, and it's sacrilegious for me to say this, but I had never seen E.T. before until last night. And I was amazed by it. Like, I cried. I knew what was going to happen. I didn't quite know all of it, but it still moved me. And I was thinking about how, like, a movie like this wouldn't be made now. Like, if a movie like this came out, it would be considered an independent film.
Yeah.
Because it's such like a small personal story. And if it was made now, there would be, endless sequels. And it was something that made me respect Steven Spielberg more, was that I know that they considered maybe doing a sequel at some point, but he's like, nah, we're just not doing that. Like, the story's done. And if E.T. was made now, there would be E.T. 5 and E.T. 6.
I know. It's true. It's true. First of all, I'm glad that you watched it, and I don't fault you at all for having not seen it until now. Just as long as you get around to seeing it, that's fine. But I think that's true. What's interesting is that, a movie like E.T., I just think it's so nuts that, like, the thinking, somehow it's become conventional wisdom that you need to spend a ton of money to make money. And I think that's completely backwards. When you spend $500 million on a movie, you have a much better chance of losing a lot of money than making a lot of money. If you make a $40 million movie, you have a much better chance of tripling your investment. You know what I mean? It's just, the math is all wrong. It's all backwards these days, and I don't get it. And I think the movies have suffered as a result. But, I'm glad, Spielberg is, he would end up getting into the sequel business eventually with Raiders, Indiana Jones movies. But back then, he was offered a lot of money to make E.T. 2. And, like you said, thank God he resisted. And I hope he continues to resist. Because the first one still works. Just re-release it. It's still, as you said, you watched it yesterday and it worked for you. You got choked up, which is, proves to me that you've got a pulse. Anyone who watches that movie will get choked up. But, I just think that not enough premium is placed on originality anymore.
And also the idea, because when I was thinking about E.T., I was thinking about how it made, shattered the box office record. And I was like, wow, that's really amazing that, like, a movie like this was the one that did that. And it's an interesting thing. And what's brilliant about it is that it's a family movie in the sense that it's not just for kids and parents watching it or want to claw their eyes out. It truly is, like, it will appeal to adults and it resonates with people regardless of how old they are, which I think is part of the reason that it did so well. And part of the reason that it couldn't exist today is because the studios would be like, no, we're just going to make something that's for the kids. But I think what's really interesting to me was that it had all that success before the internet and before social media. And I was like, what was driving all of that? And I'm like, well, certainly they were doing some kind of marketing campaigns for it, but it was probably just word of mouth. a lot of
It
word
was
of mouth
word of
of
mouth.
people having this powerful emotional reaction, telling their friends, you got to go see this movie, and
Yeah.
people going to go see it, which almost gives me hope that in the current Hollywood landscape, that if there was a movie that caused such a powerful emotional response in audiences, people would still go out and see it regardless of, whether or not a child Drew Barrymore is on TikTok
Yeah.
asking people to come see the movie.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, word of mouth is the best marketing, and it's free. It really is the best way to get the word out. The other thing that's a piece of that is we no longer live in, if you want to use a fancy word, this idea of the monoculture. You know what I mean? Like when E.T. came out in 1982, people were watching the same television shows and going to the same movies because there were 3 networks, and there weren't multiplexes, or there were a few of them, but there were single theaters, and people saw the same things. People talked about. It was a much smaller pool of pop culture for people to share, and so now we're all in our little niches, responding to our own little personal algorithms of content. And in 1982, it was, hey, this movie's coming out this weekend. This is the biggest thing going on in America right now. And if you want to be a part of the conversation, you have to go see this movie or have an opinion on this movie. And now it's like, with the whole idea of binging, it's like we can all even be watching the same show, but be in different places on it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's everything's become so fractured.
And they didn't necessarily predict that in any of the sci-fi movies. And I did it. Like, hey, the monoculture is probably going to kind of disintegrate as everyone kind of gets their own devices, and that's going to have massive political side effects and all of this. Yeah. Well, Chris, you've been very generous with your time, and I've had such a blast talking to you. Curious to hear what else is coming up for you in the future. Are you working on anything that you can share? Anything that you're excited about in the works?
Yeah, so I'm working on another book right now. It's another book about Hollywood history from this same decade, the 80s, and also into the 90s. I'm going to be a little cagey about it because I'm still writing it.
Sure. Yep.
But it's sort of a rise and fall story about a Hollywood studio. It's got a lot of intrigue and scandal and financial shenanigans and big stars, and it's a really fun thing to dig into. So I'm working on that with the same publisher as this book and the Caddyshack book. So I'm really excited about that. Thanks for saying that.
I hope you have a great summer. I know that we were dumping on the current Hollywood studios quite a bit, but are there any movies that are coming out this year that you are a little bit excited about?
Oh yeah. Don't get me wrong. I think the Mission Impossible movies are fantastic, and so far that's been my favorite of the summer movies. But looking forward a little bit, I think maybe Superman. I'm curious about it. I don't have high hopes necessarily, but I'm hopeful, and I'm always curious to see what they do with that. I don't know if I'll love it or not, but I'm eager to see it. And the other one is I kind of want to see the new remake of. I was just slagging on remakes, but I'm kind of interested to see the remake of I Know What You Did Last Summer, because I love horror movies, and I kind of love the horror movies from that 90s sort of Scream era. So I'm curious to see that. Again, I don't have any hopes that it's going to be a masterpiece, but I'm looking forward to that, spending 2 hours in the dark, eating popcorn, watching that.
This episode will be coming out. I think the new Superman movie will have been out by the time that people are listening to this. But I will also go on the record as saying that I am cautiously interested in the new Superman movie, but it does feel like a kind of like Charlie Brown with a football, where I'm like,
yes,
are you guys really going to do a good Superman movie now? Like, you just did the Man of Steel. That wasn't good. Like, all right, I'll give it another shot. So hopefully it's good. And hopefully it's a good time for everyone. So we'll see.
Well, thanks very much.
Thank you, Chris. Listener, thanks for listening to our talk. I highly recommend checking out The Future Was Now, Mad Men, Mavericks, and the epic sci-fi summer of 1982. And stay tuned for Chris's next book, which will be, I'm sure, something coming out in the near future. So until then, I've been Chris Gillespie. Thanks for listening to Poured Over.
Hello, readers. It's time for another TBR Top Off. We're going to recommend a couple of great books to pick up when you stop in for your copy of The Future Was Now. I'm Mark at my Barnes & Noble in Cincinnati, and I'm joined by my book buddy in Detroit, Donald. Hello, Donald. How are you?
Hi. It's been way too long.
Yes, I'm glad we're back into the swing of this. So I'm going to go ahead and dive right in. First of all, I'm very excited for folks to get into The Future Was Now. I think every film covered in this book is a personal and universal touchstone. Plus, it's super well researched and very well written. But if you want to dive deeper into the world of movies, I think you should check out Best Possible Place, Worst Possible Time, True Stories from a Career in Hollywood by the wonderful Barry Sonnenfeld. This man, he has made such a huge mark in the business. He's a cinematographer and director and so much more. He has helped create huge hits like one of my all-time favorites, Raising Arizona, When Harry Met Sally. He directed both Addams Family movies, the Men in Black films. He is just a powerhouse. He recently did Schmigadoon on Apple Plus, which was just a delight to watch. And you can sort of, from that body of work, you can kind of get a feel for his personality, which is very funny, very warm, just fascinating. He's just also very honest about his career and moments and people who he's come across in this account. He writes about the joys and some of the not so joys of specific celebrities. He talks about behind the scenes moments during certain films. He talks about like the films that got away from him that he just wishes he could have been a part of, and so much more. And he does so, I think this is the thing I liked about this book the most. He does it without a drop of malice. In a business like this that is so public and so potentially vapid and troubling, he really keeps things light without being naive, and without being forthcoming about being honest. I think there's a fine line that it would be difficult to walk. And I think he just does it so well. It's just an entertaining book that I think just adds an extra layer to what Hollywood can be all about, from somebody who can kind of feel like an optimist, which is something we could all stand to have from now and then, and again. So please check out Best Possible Place, Worst Possible Time by Barry Sonnenfeld. Donald, what do you have for us?
So, Mark, I have a book by Mark Harris. It's called Pictures of the Revolution. So when I was thinking about The Future Was Now, what really stuck out to me was the focus on the movie industry and how it's changed over time and how sci-fi became a really big, important piece of our culture at the time. But also a little bit about like how we are today in the movie industry and how we're at another crossroads with superhero movies not really doing well like they used to, and people looking for, something new, something different. That's just how we are. We get into our loves and then we get our fill and then we want to move on to something else. So this book called Pictures of the Revolution by Mark Harris deals with the film industry in the middle of the 1960s, when it was no longer about those black and white films or the films with, the leading lady and leading man being the focus of the movie, and more about really different, diverse, and kind of elevated stories. Movies like The Graduate, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, Heat of the Night, Bonnie and Clyde. Those were all very risque, very tricky type of movies that the American moviegoer actually were embracing. And it made, like he says, a revolution in what kind of stories we were willing to tell in the medium of film. And all of those movies are also ones that are a little bit more graphic and a little bit more adult and a little less family friendly, dealing with a range of topics that any one of those movies could be watched today and still be very, very, very relevant. Westerns, war movies, blockbuster musicals, that was all the rage back then. And now think about it. That's now coming back again. War movies are becoming more prevalent again. Musicals are finding their footing in films again, with Hamilton, the musical being, made into a movie, Wicked last year. So, this Pictures of the Revolution talks a lot about the success and failures in the 60s and then into the 70s, as it was struggling to figure out how to adapt. And no book speaks to that same problem that we're having today, like Pictures of the Revolution by Mark Harris. So that's my pick for this week.
Oh, I love that. No, thank you so much. That's perfect. But guess what? That's all the time we have for today. Thanks so much for tuning in to Poured Over. Please make sure to give us a rating and subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. We've got some fantastic interviews coming your way. You can also follow us on our socials at Barnes & Noble. Pretty simple. I'm Mark. You can follow my home store at BN Westchester. Donald, where can we find you?
You can find me at BN Livonia.
All right. Thanks for tuning in, everybody, and happy reading.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.